It has been a remarkable couple of weeks and remarkable bad. I almost don't know where to start, but I am going to start with the immense breach of privacy that's associated with the Elon Musk infiltration of the treasury, which he's done with a handful of his hand-picked tech bros or tech bro juniors who have downloaded a lot of private information. I mean, taxpayer information, Social Security information, Fed ID numbers, all the rest. David, you can detail the stuff that's most important. But this strikes me as a massive breach from a guy who's received absolutely no national security clearance.
Can you imagine what the response would have been if Barack Obama had done this? The Republicans would be out with pitchforks and wanting to string him up. I mean that in almost a literal sense. This guy is not a government official, although Trump has now said, well, he's a special member of the White House staff. I have seen Reuters, the Associated Press, and other news organizations who should know better repeatedly refer to the Department of Government Efficiency. There is no Department of Government Efficiency. You know, it would be perfectly reasonable to say the imaginary, you can't even say so-called. I think you have to say the imaginary Department of Government Efficiency. Only Congress can create departments. And not only do they have this information from the government payment system that they shouldn't have, but they've got the detail on, you know, how much you're getting in Social Security, how much you got in tax refunds. All the government payments run through this system. And that means that, among other things, now Elon Musk has information on his competitors. This is. I mean, he's the instead of the first lady, he's the first crony, and it is just astonishing. And then on another level, you know, he was under investigation for his SpaceX company on safety issues, so he fired the head of the FAA. He has no authority, but he forced the guy to resign. He has now says that the U.S. Agency for International Development, which provides more than 40% of all the humanitarian aid on the planet, that it's a criminal organization and it's time for it to die. Apparently, U.S. Aid was making some inquiries about one of Musk's companies and whether it was in compliance with the law. I haven't been able to find out anything definitive on this, but there are several strands suggesting something was going on there. And of course, one of the purposes of AID is to prevent pandemics, to prevent the resurgence of diseases that have been vanquished. So, for example, there are millions of people alive today, and therefore millions of children who are not orphans because of medicine for AIDS, viral cocktails or antiviral cocktails. If you stop taking those drugs, the AIDS virus just explodes and you are once again deep in that disease. And people are going to die needlessly over this. Now, you might think, well, they haven't thought that through. They don't want people to die. We kept detailing at DC Report when we ran our Trump death tracker, how many people died because of the mishandling in the first Trump administration of COVID. And if you compare us to South Korea, a much more densely populated country, which had its first COVID case the same day we did, instead of 1.2 million plus Americans dying, we should have had around 100,000. So Donald Trump's incompetence has already killed 1 million American people. He doesn't have any qualms about that. This isn't Dwight Eisenhower going to bed at night troubled about all the young men he sent to their deaths on the beaches in Normandy because it was his duty to do it. Donald doesn't have a conscience. And finally, the thing I find most amazing that's being badly reported right now is Trump has given several statements in recent days about what a terrible trade agreements we have. I mean, this is just, you look at these agreements with Canada and Mexico. What idiot did these deals? Oh, I'm sorry, Donald Trump. That was the only other accomplishment of his administration beyond tax cuts for the super rich was redoing NAFTA. And he's the one now attacking, this is a stupid policy. There is no history. There's no conscience. There's no competence. There is criminality and a lust for unchecked power.
Yeah, it is that. And thank you for the comical aspect, reminding us of the, this righteous indignation about who wired this house? The electronic, you did, sir. Who made this trade deal? You did, sir. In 2018, you made this deal. It is your deal from 2018, the one with Canadians.
And, if you work for a national news organization and you get to go to Washington, that's supposed to be a big deal. You earned your way to get there. Well, I'm sorry. I tape every night the 3 network news shows. They haven't gotten into this. There may have been a passing mention on one of them. The big national newspapers, I don't see them going after this. That should be a major news story. And on the getting into the FBI and the payment system at the Treasury, go back to 2016. Remember all the front page stories, particularly in my former newspaper, the New York Times, about Hillary Clinton's email server? What a threat to national security. You mean letting these young men, all younger than 26, according to Wired magazine, which identified a bunch of them, isn't a threat to national security? Sending FBI agents in counterintelligence home and indicating you're going to be fired because the president thinks that you're not loyal to him personally, that's not a threat to national security. I mean, these are hair on fire stories, and they're being covered as, oh, there was an unusual development in Washington yesterday.
There is a bizarre, almost sane washing that goes on by the way it's being reported. You're absolutely right about that.
And just one more thing: if you go back and study, as I did before I taught the law of the ancient world, how Rome went from being a republic to a dictatorship, it still had the appearance of a democracy, or if not a democracy, at least an elite, broad leadership. The Senate was still there. It just didn't matter. That didn't happen like suddenly. It wasn't like Nazi Germany. And even then, it took Hitler several years to work things out. I mean, 53 days to overthrow the government, but to really take power took longer than that. Rome took 40 years. 40 years to go from a republic to a dictatorship. And so, there's plenty of time for Trump here to fulfill his desire to become our dictator, whatever he calls himself. And it's just not being addressed with, I think, the appropriate level of concern and the reality that what you are seeing right in front of your eyes is a dictatorship being created.
Well, I think the Elon Musk stuff, where he is now infiltrating the Treasury and closed down temporarily USAID. I talked about it yesterday. I mean, I grew up in Washington, D.C., so I know a bunch of people who work at AID, and it was really doing important work in outreach, and you can have problems with any one particular funding program, but to close it all down the way he did, of course, it's illegal. He couldn't do it anyway, but he did successfully lock USAID people out of their computers. He's able to do these things, and as you say, it is a hair on fire moment, but it's kind of being lost in all the other hair on fire moments, unless you're a legal or a security expert, right. In which case I think you see it as an absolute nightmare.
One of the most prominent print journalists in America just posted a little bit ago at Facebook that, AID has corruption in it. Okay. Yes, you want to provide food or medicine to people in a war-torn country where they're dealing with warlords, not legitimate governments. You're going to pay them off. I mean, I've interviewed workers for Oxfam who told me about taking grocery bags full of $20, $50, and $100 US bills to give to the warlords so they could get the food to the starving people. If you want to call that corruption, call it corruption. But, suddenly there's this moral equivalence that my former, I wrote for this editor at one time, is putting in there. And it's like, boy, you're missing the donut for the hole.
Well, it reminds me a little bit of what was going on in Afghanistan when the only real in what's his name's book, he talks about it. The general who wrote the book, and now I forget his name. Anyway, he talks about the fact that
Stanley McChrystal.
Yeah, McChrystal. Thank you. So the only kind of real improvement that was made was not necessarily military. It was the real giant steps forward in control and normalization of Afghanistan was done with bribing the tribes, bribing the warlords.
You can go on YouTube. It'll take you a while to find it, but you can see video of what I'm about to describe. The George W. Bush administration, instead of having the coalition of troops that was put together under the Powell Doctrine to get Osama bin Laden, flew a fleet, and I do mean a fleet, of C-17 cargo aircraft, the kind you saw in the Afghanistan collapse when the last U.S. people were leaving, with U.S. dollars on pallets that had to have tractors come up and lift the pallets up on the forklift and put them into the truck. $17 billion of U.S. cash was given to the warlords who said, oh, yeah, give us this money and we'll go catch Osama bin Laden for you. Of course, they took our money. They laughed at us. And wasn't until Obama became president that we actually got him, because George W. Bush famously said, I don't even care anymore if we get him.
Right.
And you know, that's corruption. That's rank stupidity combined with corruption. But people think George W. Bush did this great job and Barack Obama was this terrible person. One of the little thing of what's about to happen, Mark, they haven't moved yet to repeal the Affordable Care Act. You can be sure that if they don't outright repeal it, they're going to scale it way back, and they're going to scale way back on Medicaid, the federal program for poor people. And apparently something like 70 million Americans, that's 1 in 5 Americans, are on Medicaid. I was surprised the number's that large. I watched yet another one of these journalists on the street interviewing people with a microphone and a TV camera. So what do you think about Obamacare? Oh, I'm glad we elected Donald Trump. We'll get rid of Obamacare right away. Well, what do you think about the Affordable Care Act? Well, I'm a single mother with 3 kids, and it's desperately important to me because I don't know what I'd do without it. Well, ma'am, do you understand that Obamacare and the Affordable Care Act are the same thing? No, they're not. There's a reason Donald loves the poorly educated. And you see it right there. And that is not an anomaly. I have seen versions of that. Jordan Klepper and various lesser known people, as well as straight journalists, have done stuff like that. And I think a lot of people who voted for Donald Trump still aren't aware of what's about to happen to them, because this is a white supremacist oligarch government led by the richest man in the world and his major domo, Donald Trump.
It's always, frankly, with the decisions at the Supreme Court level and even lower court levels on at some point, it's always been an oligarchy a bit, David. Money has really ruled the day. But we've always had kind of a quiet oligarchy where at least we would, there was a sense that we could beat it back. It might be a delusional sense, but it was a sense nonetheless. Now it's really come out of the shadows. And as you say, you've got the richest man in the world with access to the treasury. He's running amok in U.S. government, and no one's really saying much. Even the opposition, the Democrats, they are, they passed a resolution of some kind. They really need, and we talked about this a little bit in our last visit, they really need the media figures. I think of Elizabeth Warren as one of them. Bernie Sanders is another. They need a next generation of those. Cory Booker can be good at times to really play the messaging game, because that, a resolution in Congress, as you've just suggested, it's a tree falling in the forest. You really need to cut through the noise.
Yeah, the Democrats need to get basic media training. How you answer questions on TV. And it's not the way you write an article. It's not the way you debate something. There are techniques to do this. They're not that hard to learn. And they absolutely need to do that. Instead of, we just saw Chuck Schumer do a demonstration in Congress. And it was just, he held up an avocado and he says, that's how we get guacamole. Really? I
Yeah.
had not a clue. I thought it came from tomatoes.
He was he was talking about the Mexico tariffs is what David's
Yeah, because
talking
the
about. Yeah.
avocados come from there.
Yeah.
And the other thing journalists haven't caught on to is that, a trade war is not a one-sided issue here. Donald Trump blinked. I just put up on Facebook from somebody in my story, a wonderful little cartoon. Justin Trudeau's on the phone in the top one, and the new president of Mexico, whose name I don't recall at the moment, are on the phone.
Scheinbaum, is it? Or
Yes, Scheinbaum. And they both essentially say, hey, we gave him what he already had and he blinked. This was a complete loss for Trump here on the tariff front for the moment. As soon as Elon Musk realized, Ontario is taking away my $110 million gift for Starlink, and we're going to stop buying various products in the U.S., especially American liquor, wine, and beer, because provincial governments there have a monopoly on wholesale distribution of alcohol. They determine which brands get bought. And the coverage of this by the Washington press corps is atrocious, but don't stop paying attention to the news just because they're not doing a good job, because then you won't know anything. And that's what Donald wants. He wants an information vacuum. He wants you to not realize what he is doing. And he just has a couple more steps he needs to do. He needs to replace the top admirals and generals with people promoted out of order. He needs to replace the top people at the FBI with people who will be loyal to him and who will go after his enemies and ignore the vital work the FBI does, essentially half their workload, of interdicting terrorist threats and other national security threats to the United States. And if you're President Xi, you should be sitting in Tiananmen Square at the Hall of the People applauding, because by cutting off money to aid, which Elon Musk calls a criminal organization that must die, what you're doing is driving undeveloped countries into the arms of the Chinese. I'm sorry, an eighth grader should be able to figure this out. Donald, he won't understand that at all. It's beyond his capacity.
Yeah, we spoke about this yesterday, the fact that, the Road and Belts initiative that China has throughout the continent of Africa and beyond, it gives them a presence, and it gives them a connection to communities across Africa that are grateful to them for the infrastructure that they've paid for. And that's what we used to do.
Right. And doing things like buying up large areas of land where, as sea level rises, will be arable. You'll be able to grow crops on it, and with water rights to go with that land in Africa, further helps the Chinese in their goal to replace us as the dominant country. I mean, we are an empire led by someone who makes both Caligula and Nero seem like sophisticated statesmen and administrators.
So we've touched on Musk and you, I think, in talking about the rollback of Obamacare, the ACA, I think touch on Vogt, who is the guy who's going to control OMB. Yeah. That's Russell, spells it V-A-U-G-H-T. I think it's pronounced Vogt. He's very much, he's the lead author of Project 2025. And so rolling back ACA is key. And also eliminating the Department of Education. I wonder if you could, you understand government, I think, a little bit better than most of us, and you can speak to, what that would do. Like, there are a lot of aspects to closing down an entire department of the government, especially the Department of Education, I would think.
Well, first and foremost, the president doesn't have the authority to do this. Back when Richard Nixon was president, he tried to not spend money Congress directed. It was called impounding. Congress passed the Anti-Impoundment Act, and they strengthened it a few years ago. And if Trump is hoping in that particular matter to get a favorable Supreme Court ruling, I think he will be disappointed, because when John Glover Roberts was a young attorney, he was first hired by the federal government during the Reagan administration to suppress black voters. There was a clear effort in the Reagan administration to suppress black voting, and he was in that unit. But he wrote a memo that's publicly available in 1985 that the president cannot refuse to spend the money that Congress has authorized. He does not have that power. And, Donald has said, I have an Article 2 that says I can do anything I want. Please, when the show is over, just go to the internet, type in Constitution Article 2. Half of it is about the oath of office, but essentially all it says is the President of the United States is the errand boy of Congress who will fulfill its directives, and he's commander-in-chief of the military. It doesn't give him any other power. It's Congress that decides these things, and Trump doesn't have the authority to do this. Now, will he get away with it? Well, some of the judges Trump has appointed have turned out to be principled, but a number of them, Eileen Cannon, have turned out to completely ignore the Constitution and to, as she literally wrote in her first order dealing with the stolen documents case, that Donald Trump deserves special treatment, a just basic violation of her oath of office. But I think on that one, he will lose. But of course, he'll have achieved his goal if aid suddenly starts killing literally millions of people in Africa, the Middle East, Asia, because we've stopped providing AIDS medications. He'll have succeeded in throwing out of work the well-educated people who make the viral medicines. The people who work in pharmaceutical companies making the drugs, they're not the inventors I'm talking about, the people who actually make them. Those are not lunkhead jobs for the poorly educated. And the effort here is very clear. It is to destroy America as we've known it so that Donald Trump can do as he wishes.
It's interesting. D. Elliott asks, ask David K. Johnston, when will people start disappearing like Russia does? Doesn't feel like that's their style, David, but is that possible?
Well, two aspects to this. First one is Donald Trump is the third generation head of a four-generation white-collar crime family. So they don't break your legs. They don't kill you. They steal with contracts, with broken promises, with simple refusals to pay. That said, that is their style. That is Donald's style. That said, once you become a dictatorship, sooner or later there are firing squads. And among the first people who get killed when the dictator finally realizes he has to take some action to ensure his safety is you kill the true believers. Hitler, the Night of the Long Knives. Stalin killed the Bolsheviks who led the revolution in 1914. He didn't go kill the white Russians who remained in Russia, many of whom fled to the United States, the aristocrats or the people who worked for the aristocrats, who were lawyers, bankers, accountants, whatever. No, he killed the true believer, super loyalist Bolsheviks. And so it may take a long time. Donald Trump may be dead and we could be on Emperor 4, but eventually there will be firing squads. And I assure you it's something that I have personally thought about, because if it comes sooner than later, I'm a candidate.
Yeah.
And by the way, I'm not backing down.
I get why you say that. It strikes me that kind of see your first point, that Trump doesn't want to really dirty his hands with firing squads. And I mean, right. He's, as you say, he's a grifter and a white collar criminal.
Hey, and he's a very cowardly man personally. It's an analogy to George W. Bush. Molly Ivins, the terrific journalist, went to high school with George W. Bush. Her father was a very rich oil executive. And one summer, after George W. Bush had been sent off to boarding school somewhere in New England, he comes back to Houston. And they're at the mansion of one of the rich parents in a neighborhood called, I think, River Oaks. And a fight breaks out among the boys. And the girls all gather around in a circle watching this thing, including Molly Ivins, who was like over 6 feet tall and used to say, I was a Clydesdale among the thoroughbreds. And there's one guy who's not in the fight, George W. Bush, who backs up and gets behind the girls. Donald is like that. He talks tough, but he's not tough. He's a marshmallow.
Well, he does like the flex. You know, David, I was saying in the first hour that these trade threats and the tariff threats, they are flexes. When he flexes against Panama, and I don't know how that's going to work out, but he's going to, at some point, back down or, you know, claim victory. He claimed victory over Colombia. He is now smack talking the Euro nations. Okay. I mean, he, you know, again, he's coming from a position of power as president of the United States. But these, I feel, are flexes designed to dominate the news cycle. He loves that media news cycle, right, David? I learned that from you.
Yeah. And no, absolutely. He's deflecting you from the substantial things they're doing, like trying to identify FBI agents so they can punish them. And he is getting news coverage that focuses on him instead of the pushback. Colombia didn't fold. Colombia simply said, you know, we'll take people from that are due to our country, but you're not going to bring them in a military plane shackled when they're not accused of any kind of violent crime, which they were not. So it's Trump who backed down, but you have to step back from Washington. I mean, you know, every community at some point becomes very small. The social elite of New York City, it may not be just 400 of them as in Mrs. Astor's ballroom in the Gilded Age, but it's still a pretty small group of people at some point. And Donald is in Washington not getting the kind of coverage he should get because most prominent journalists are part of the whole social milieu. You know, their kids go to school with Senator so-and-so's kids and Secretary so-and-so's kids. They belong to the same country club if they have enough money to do that sort of thing, or they want to. And so that's the reason that when I covered Washington off and on my whole career, I would never go there. When I covered the IRS, I did not live in Washington, D.C., and I went there 10 days a year, you know, for 1 or 2 day visits. This is in many ways a very corrupt system because these people all have to get along with each other, especially because of the tendency in this country toward access journalism instead of documentary journalism.
Sure, that's what's led to ABC. Well, the ABC tap out on the 15 million, the Stephanopoulos case, the CBS tap out, that was associated, I think, with regulatory stuff that they needed. Disney still needed regulatory passion. But to your point, I know many people, White House correspondents, some have been on this show, who tell me you've got to temper a little bit sometimes the questioning that you do if you want to get access, and you need access in order to get luminaries on your show every night. You know, if you want to book your show, same is true at MSNBC and all these other places. But what I'm seeing, David, is Trump winning in the short term, at least to dominating these news cycles for all the reasons that you've detailed. And I'm wondering, and I'm seeing some, if you could just, well, this is kind of but there is a lot to this. Speaker of the Truth says, the point is kleptocracy and autocracy by the oligarchy. We're going to witness the biggest heist in world history. The global economy will collapse. Now, it's the last part of that I want to ask you about. I think we can all stipulate to some part of the prior part of the question. But will the global economy collapse? And speak to that, if you would, please.
Well, collapse, I think, is probably too strong of a word. We even in the 2008 recession, I would not, you know, it was called routinely a collapse. And there were all these stories, you know, that the lending was freezing. And I wrote a piece about the fact that on the very day that I think the Washington Post had a front page story that the whole lending markets had frozen, I had gotten 6 pieces of mail offering to loan me money at 0 interest or 2% interest for a couple of years. There were areas of the lending market. But a couple of things are likely going to happen. Trade wars are not good for commerce. If we're not selling our goods to other countries, that means our American workers are going to lose their jobs. If we don't continue supporting with armaments the Ukrainians, because we're not giving them cash. I mean, we give them a little bit of cash, but it's inconsequential. We are giving them bullets and rockets and guns and jet fighters. Those are American job programs. They employ Americans. So I think that world growth, economic growth, will stop. It may temporarily reverse. You'll notice that a number of very prominent, wealthy people, Ray Dalio, the hedge fund manager, Warren Buffett, have sold a lot of their stocks. They're still very, very heavily in the stock market, but they've got a lot of cash on hand. Frankly, that's what I've done with our retirement money. At the moment, I can earn 4% with no risk, or almost no risk. And if the stock market falls a third or half down the road, and it may take a year or two, I can buy back much more at a lower price. A few people managed to pull that off in 2009. So I think there are clear signs that the economy will not continue to boom as it did under Joe Biden. And remember, Trump has convinced people that many people, that we were in a recession under Joe Biden when we had the strongest economy in the world. We had the lowest inflation, and it fell and fell and fell till it was below the post-World War II average. We had the greatest economics growth, and by far, the job growth was unbelievably off the chart. Since 1990, under Republican presidents, we've added net 1 million jobs. Under Democrats, we've added more than 20 million jobs. And I think it may be 50 million jobs. I'm sorry, it's 50 million jobs. The inability to confuse people is substantial at the common folk level, but at the top, you're going to see less investment by big companies. You're going to see stranded investment if they yank promised money for solar and wind, which Donald is clearly very against. The oil industry is not going to invest a lot more money in drilling simply because the U.S. is the biggest producer in the world right now. We're producing 6 barrels of oil for every 5 that Saudi Arabia does, they're next, and 7 for every one the Russians do, they're third. We're going to see the Canadians and the Mexicans and the Chinese are major trading partners, and the US and the EU, if Trump goes after them as he promises, they're going to take actions in their own self-interest. They're not going to just roll over and say, "Oh yes, oh Mr. Trump, please, please." I mean, he's literally given speeches where he says people beg him not to do things. None of them have done that, and none of them will. At the some big sporting event in Toronto the other day, when the U.S. Because it was a U.S.-Canadian team, when they played the U.S. national anthem, the room was just full of booze. Not because people hate Americans, they hate the Trump administration.
Sure. I mean, it is, to our best friends, arguably. I mean, I guess it'd be the British and the Canadians in a photo finish, we have.
Oh, you mean who's our best friend? Australia. Oh, no. The most loyal lapdog to America since World War II has been Australia, followed by Canada, followed by Britain. But Australia.
All right. So it's a photo finish for second. Okay. Okay. But look, I've got to wrap up with you, but I really feel as though the Musk part of weaponizing the cost cutting that he's, he goes in claiming, I want to cut costs and look at government efficiencies. And then he infiltrates all of these government agencies, Treasury, USAID, and has literally locked government employees out from their computers. This is a massive breach, David. I'd love to talk to you more about it. And also next time, I'd like to talk about what can be done from the opposition party that's really out of power.
That's a really important thing. I was on with some theologians today for their podcast, and that was the key thing we talked about was what can you do? And just one thought for people to think about between now and next Tuesday. In the 60s, there was a whole movement to teach people you are empowered. It's gone away. What you hear today is we can't do anything about it. We can't fight the oligarchs. We can't fight City Hall. Wrong. Absolutely wrong. But we don't have the institutions around that taught people how to do that. The unions and the interdenominational social justice groups, those are mostly gone. But we ultimately are the ones who have the authority and the power.
And I would just, as a coda to that, say that Democrats can also. I remind them of Tommy Tuberville, who held up all of Biden's military promotions. They were the minority party. It was one stinking senator. One stinking senator, the minority party, can do a lot to hold things up, and the Democrats have that option as well. So,
Yep.
All right, David, thank you. Love our
See
time
you next
together.
week.
Hi, it's Mark, and I thought that was great. Hit the notification bell. You'll know whenever there's a new video being dropped, and please subscribe to our channel to help us save the universe.